بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين هو الأول وهو الآخر هو الظاهر وهو الباطن لا إله إلا هو لا إله إلا الله. He's the first, He's the last, He's the hidden and He's the manifest. There is no existence but through Him. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Kareem to all those who are fasting and those who are not. Ramadan Kareem. I chose this topic really because I thought it might be a bit more light in the month of Ramadan to look at the more classical texts within the Sufi tradition, some of which predate a lot of the masters with which we are associated, such as Rumi. And they're part of the evolution of what one would call the inner dimension of Islam. Because Sufism has been interpreted in many different directions as being somehow connected with early Christian monasticism or connected with the Buddhist tradition or even with Hinduism, and that it came into fruition and flowering as a result of Islam's interaction with these civilizations. This thesis that it is somehow incidental or somehow disconnected from the Sharia focus of Islam, I think has been proven to be both historically incorrect and also in terms of the content of Tasawwuf itself. Tasawwuf is actually no more and no less than the inner dimension of Islam. And the fact that it has apparent and sometimes real connections with other inner dimensions of other great spiritual traditions is not really accidental, because all of these originate from one source and empty into one ocean. So there's bound to be similarities. There's no question that in the early days of Islam, in the years immediately following the Prophet, there was a very powerful current within Islam that counterposed, as it were, the explosive outer forms in which Islam emerged, in the form of expansion, territorial expansion, in the form of large number of converts coming to Islam, and in the form of creating the beginnings and sinews of a unique civilization of its own. There was a parallel track, which was those who walked away or turned away from the outer manifestations of power and wealth and opulence, and the outer manifestations of knowledge organized in ritualistic form or organized in philosophical form or theological form. So the roots of Tasawwuf can go back to these very, very early days. Even there are some episodes or anecdotes that goes to the days of the Prophet himself, when there was the group known as Ahl al-Suffa, those who stood out or sat in front of a kind of bench outside of the main mosque in Medina, which was, as you know, the Prophet's own home. And that these people spent their days and nights in remembrance and dhikr. And when one of the companions came and tried to move them, shoo them away, the Prophet himself interceded and spoke in to their favor, to their advantage, basically confirming that Islam has an outer dimension and an inner dimension. So this line continued and expressed itself in the very early days in the form of kind of, I would say it was the tasawwuf, not of love, but of fear. There was great fear of the consequences of going against the commands and the ordinances of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the sense of the might and awe was a common thread amongst the very early Sufis. They were not even called Sufis then, they were called Zuhad. Zuhad is an Arabic term for ascetics. And of course there are some similarities to Christian monasticism at that point. That is the idea of withdrawal from the world and the form of inner purification. But apart from these outer similarities, there's something unique to the tradition of Islam, which was embodied in early Tasawwuf. Then, of course, as the empire of the Muslims became more worldly, more opulent, more material, the reaction became even greater. And more people began to withdraw, as it were, from connections to power and connections to what they saw as a distortion in the way that Islam was moving, and began to congregate and form groups. But they were always in the background. They were always, from time to time, the ruler, like Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, may have been affected by the extreme materialism and opulence and the extravagance of the court, and basically supported and backed this kind of ascetic withdrawal. So by the time you get around to the 2nd and 3rd century, the schools of Tasawwuf, as we know them, did not really exist, but there was recognized groupings of individuals, some of whom formed circles around them, and some of whom began to explore, as it were, the outer dimensions of what is permissible within the structures of Islam. And you had several schools emerging. The first one was around Baghdad. It was not the first one, but one of the earliest recognized ones. They were known as the Sufis of Baghdad. Basically, groups of people who congregated around the figure of Al-Junayd. And before him, there were other earlier people like Junayd's uncle, Sahel. And it was a group that saw the inner dimensions or the spiritual aspects of Islam, very closely connected to being observant to the rituals and to the forms, the dogma of the deen, but nevertheless emphasizing suluk, which is conduct, and akhlaq, which is ethics. These were later known after the fact, as it were, as the school of sober Sufism. The Sufism that is rigorous in terms of its outer commitments, but also looks at the inner dimensions, primarily in the form of conduct, primarily in the form of the correct form of behavior that reflects a sense of the virtues, which within the terms of Tasawwuf emanated all from the names and the attributes of the divine. Another school emerged about the same time, called the school of Khorasan. Mainly, Khorasan now is a province of Iran, but in the early days of the Islamic world, that's the 2nd, 3rd century, Khorasan was a region that included what is now eastern Iran, all of Afghanistan, and most of what is northern Pakistan. It was called Ma Wara al-Nahr, what beyond the river Oxus, being the frontiers of Khorasan. And Khorasan was a strange environment. I don't know if anybody has been there. If you go to, for example, Mashhad or Herat in Afghanistan, it's really a very, very extraordinary spiritual air about it. It's plains, and suddenly they have oases, towns, and cities emerging really out of the mirage, as it were. And it's on a plateau. So the winters are quite harsh, very unlike the Middle East. And it seems to nurture and to not exaggerate, but amplify those who are so inclined spiritually. It gives them a much greater expansiveness. It becomes, as it were, the tasawwuf of expansion, the tasawwuf of intoxication, what is known in Arabic as sukur. So the school of Khorasan, built around individuals such as Bayezid al-Bistami, which you might have heard of, was much more prepared, much more willing to acknowledge, as it were, the formlessness of this inner intoxication. And that rather than seeing it in the forms of conduct and ethics, it saw it in terms of the outer limits of knowledge and the outer limits of experience. So it's much more experiential, much more potent, much more emotive. I won't say emotional, but emotive. Now, this lack of control, as it were, of the school of Khorasan was also the kiss of death, as it were, of the early Sufis. This willingness to explore limits, this willingness to go beyond boundaries, at some point created a crisis between these kinds of Sufis and the orthodoxy, which was represented more and more by a kind of established Islam, the Islam of the Madahib, the Islam of the various schools that were beginning to crystallize in terms of their outer forms. And the crisis within Tasawwuf reached a kind of peak with the trial and then execution of Al-Hallaj, Mansur Al-Hallaj. You might have come across the name. He began to express openly what many Sufis of the intoxicated school were saying privately. That is the immanence of the divine in the individual was something that was real and palpable. That the nature of a human being's relationship with the divine was not only with a transcendent being, one that was beyond description and beyond approach, but rather one that is within the individual, relying on their own experiences as well as on confirmations from for example, the Quranic ayah which says that he is closer to you than the jugular vein. And these exclamations began to affect the relationship of the Sufi circles with the establishment. And it led to his trial and then his execution sometime in the 9th century, 2nd century Hijri, which created a crisis in Sufism. That is, how can this body of people can be contained or can coexist with an increasingly formal orthodoxy? Of course, orthodoxy rejects the idea that one can ever reach the possibility of any kind of connection with the divine through one's own experiences or through one's own exercises, spiritual exercises. It totally rejects that. So this crisis, as it were, forced or obliged the Sufis who remained, who were not caught up in this dragnet, anti-Sufi dragnet, to come up with a different formula, different way in which they were to interact with the broader body of Muslims. And that led to the famous synthesis of Ghazali, where the attempt to create a kind of common ground between the demands of inner experience and the demands of living and working in a community which is bound by certain rules. This synthesis was to some extent successful. And as a result of that synthesis, that is, Sufi precepts fusing or merging into part of the body of Islam, and the rituals and the doctrines of outer Islam being acknowledged by the Sufis, became a kind of synthesis which really governed the Muslim world until very recently. And out of the synthesis, a number of classical works began to come about. basically framing the first 2 centuries in ways that reflected the demands of reaching an accommodation between the orthodoxy, between the establishment, and between these groups that have finally found for themselves a space within the community. And a number of books came out, a number of very, very important texts. They fell in basically 3 categories, I would say. The first category are what one called texts of suluk and akhlaq, texts of ethics and of conduct. And these mainly looked at the early companions and the early ascetics as having sets of virtues that were important in the spiritual path. So virtues of sincerity, virtues of doing without, virtues of abstinence, virtues of generosity, virtues of commitment, of compassion, and so on, were given a very, very significant aspect as an essential part of the deen. And you have, the earliest text was by a man called Abu Bakr Kalabali. Most of these people who wrote these texts came from the area that I call Khurasan. Kalabali came from Naishapur, which is near Mashhad now. Sulami also came from that area. Isfahani came from Isfahan. Abu Nasr al-Sarraj. The first book that came that tried to make a synthesis between the two and to present the actions and these sayings in anecdotal form of these early Sufis was Kalabadi's book. But the single most significant book of that period was the book that I'll be talking about now, called the Tabaqat of Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami. The books or these series of Tabaqat, which means the orders or the hierarchies, was a common genre, as it were, of that period of Islam. You have the Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'ad, which gives you the hierarchies and the biographies of the various companions of the Prophet. The Tabaqat of Sulami dealt with the early Sufis, mainly in anecdotal form. And the forms were really a kind of biography, as it were, partly hagiographic. Sometimes, it involves some maybe supra-rational aspects to it. Reports and anecdotes from these early Sufis, and aphorisms and maxims that express these individuals' understanding of what are the key components of the science of tasawwuf, as it were, or ilm al-tasawwuf. They're generally designed for the general reader, and if you read them in Arabic or a few of them in Persian, for example, the Hujwiri, this book was buried, I think, in Lahore. It's called Baba Minj or something. Yes. Yeah. They were written in Persian, but mainly in Arabic. And they have these three-part division, three-part kind of biography, mainly genealogy and also the early years and later years of these people. Anecdotes regarding sometimes involving what are known as karamat, or near miracles, and maxims and aphorisms. And they are focused on the understanding of the divinity as an approachable divinity, one that is, I would call it even the idea of a personal God. To them, the approachability of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes a kind of personal relationship. They don't go into the higher realms or the higher aspects. They don't stray into these higher realms of spirituality and gnosis. There were other texts that came, sometimes, few of them at this period, but most later, that dealt with the more Gnostic aspects, the more, how shall I put it, the less confined, the aspects of the inner journey which is less bounded. I discussed a few months ago Neferi as an example of that. But there were quite a few other people, not the same profundity as him, like Hakim al-Tirmidhi, for example. And then when Ibn Arabi came on the scene, there were Ibn Arabi and, of course, his followers and commentators like Shabistari. I think your friend in California, Bob Darius, he had a translation of Shabistari. And most of these people came from this Khurasan, few from Baghdad. The only Arab of note, apart from Ibn Arabi, in this group was the poet Ibn al-Farid, who was Egyptian and buried in Egypt, where his poetry really goes to the boundaries, even beyond. And here, these texts deal mainly with self-knowledge and the duality-unity aspects of the divine, and frequently expressed in terms of what you now know as the haqq, for example, or truth or reality. And at the edges of these Gnostic texts, they merge into philosophy, like the philosophy of Ibn Sina or the philosophy of Sahrawardi, the Ishraqiyya, or Mullah Sadra. And they deal with a concept that has become known as the unity of existence, or in Arabic as wahdat al-wujud. They also draw on ethics, but ethics to them are just a byproduct of the journey to unity, rather than being the central product. And by the time you come to the middle periods of Islam, you have, as it were, the tripartite divisions. By the time you come to Rumi, you have the tripartite divisions that become sort of fixed. That the common person should be bound by the Sharia and the outer forms of Islam. The elect, what is called as the elect, khassa, the rank and file of the Sufis, they should be Sharia focused partly, but their Sharia should be confined within ethics and conduct. And those, the Arifs, the Gnostics, the elect of the elect, the Khawas al-Khawas, are those who immerse themselves in the journey of Tawheed, oneness, qualified by ethics and by Sharia. So, depending on which of these categories you fell in, there were the equivalent, as it were, circles and the equivalent orders and the equivalent pathways. And in that period, I'd say the middle century, sometime around the 5th century Hijri, which would be around the 12th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, what we now know as tariqas became organized to express these various trends and tendencies within Tasawwuf and within Islam. So I'll give you a bit of an example of some of these texts here of Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami. Some of these early Sufis became, as it were, fixed as in the canon, and you'll find their names repeated time and time again. I'm sure in many of the stories of Rumi, you might have come across these names. For example, the name of Al-Fudayl, Fudayl ibn Hayyab, who's known also as Husayl. The name, for example, of the Nun al-Masri is one of the earliest Sufis. The name of Ibrahim ibn Adham, it's known in Arabic as Ibrahim ibn Adham, the Buddha-like prince who, while he was, I mean, the story of the Buddha, as you know, is that he was locked up in his house, and then he escaped with a retainer to see the world. And then he saw the signs of suffering. He saw an old man, and he saw this man in pain or woman in pain. Then he saw death, and these things shook him. A similar story relates to Ibrahim ibn Adham, who again was a prince of Balkh. Whether he was a prince or not is another matter, but he was out hunting, and hunting, usually in Sufi terms, is seen as a wasteful and useless activity. It wastes time and kills for sport. So a hunter, as symbolically in the works of Tasawwuf, it's something to be avoided. So he was out with his retainers hunting, and he gets lost. And he comes across this old shepherd who looks at him and, in a disparaging way and says to him, "You are wasting your life." And apparently has a kind of Pauline moment, and he immediately falls into a swoon. This is a common trope in all these stories, people falling into swoons, and wakes up renouncing the world, and moves on to become an itinerant pilgrim, and ends up as a sage in Mecca. The stories, for example, of Bishr al-Hafi, who is an early Sufi of Baghdad. Hafi means barefoot. And how he came into Tasawwuf. These people, his story and the story of another one, Ma'ruf al-Karki, is given as an example of people who are overwhelmed by the beauty and majesty of the inner dimensions of Islam and abandon their previous allegiance to whatever religion they follow. You have another famous Sufi called Sari Saqati. Again, his name appears in nearly all of the great works of Tasawwuf, of Rumi and others, as an example of Al-Harith al-Muhasibi. Muhasibi means the person who constantly held himself to account. And there's a whole school about the need to hold yourself accountable for your actions, to constantly have inner reflection on your actions of the day, your actions of the month, your entire life experience must be reviewed constantly within the frame of ethical. Shaqiq al-Balkhi. These are names that are those who are on the path would know these names. And then the name, for example, of Bayezid al-Bastami, who is one of the early Sufis of Khorasan. As I mentioned, those who became so intoxicated with the immanence, the proximity of the divine presence that they are overwhelmed by it. And their utterances become borderline and blasphemous. For example, Bayezid Bastami was known to do things that are outrageous, to get people to stop treating him as an exceptional person. In Ramadan, like this month, he was fasting, and then people came all around him and started praising him and extolling his virtues. And to shock them, he broke his fast right in front of them. He says, "I want a piece of bread and I want a glass of water." So all of the people, all the Sharia-minded people ran away. They said, "What kind of Muslim is this?" But he did that specifically because he wanted to avoid being seen. And he came, there's a famous anecdote which is reported in the book by, in the Tabaqat, it's not Sulami, where somebody knocks on the door. And Bayezid says, "Who are you?" The guy says, I don't know, Ahmed. He says, "I don't know, Ahmed, who are you?" He says, I am I. He says, "I don't know you." He says, "Who are you?" He says, "I am you." So that's it. you can see that the tripartite division between I, you, and both, the loss of differentiation of individuals as they approach higher and higher realms. Many of these stories, some of them are interesting, some of them are extraordinary, some of them are believable, some of them are, I won't say unbelievable, but they're supra-rational. You have to take them with the measure, not of the 21st century, but the measure of the 3rd and 4th century Hijri in Islam. And you can see the profound impact it has. These miracles or karamat, for example, in the case of Shaqiq al-Balkhi, where he went on a ship, and the ship became wind-tossed afterwards, but the captain of the ship, he said he was a stowaway. So he wanted to throw him overboard into the middle of the sea. And as they were about to throw him overboard, fish popped up with a coin in its mouth to pay for it. Then, of course, there's other stories associated with him being on a ship that was wind-tossed, and how everybody was praying for the winds to die down, for the storm to abate. And he was praying not for its opposite, he was praying for whatever the will of Allah is. Whatever happens, it's fine. And as soon as he starts, everything abates and the wind goes down. These are anecdotal stories written for a mass or individuals who wanted to enliven their spiritual life. And these books were meant for that purpose. They were not meant to be sort of text to be read as textbooks and so on. They were meant to be instructive, didactic. And some of these stories carry on into modern times. What I find most interesting, apart from the stories which are interesting, is the maxims of some of these early masters, because they still hold true after all these centuries. They have insights into what we consider to be virtues. And these insights, some of them are extremely profound and can sort of bracket your spiritual life. For example, these are some of the sayings of Al-Fudayl, for example. Well, I was going to say it in Arabic, but I won't, so I'll just translate it. He says that the essence of doing without is basically to be content with whatever decree comes about. So it is not, I'm going to withhold my fast, I'm not going to withhold from eating, or I'm going to do without, because it's going to provide me with rewards or provide me with gains. It is basically an acknowledgement that whatever happens at any moment in time is really a congruence of enormous forces and events that have transpired from pre-existence until now. Every single event that happens has a prehistory. And this prehistory has its own prehistory and goes back and back and back. So this is to be content with whatever transpires, is to be content with the perfection of these decrees. Because you can't really deny their perfectibility. I'm reading this paper now. You say, what's so perfect about it? But this reading of this paper is as a result of enormous individual atomistic events that have taken place a second before that, going back to pre-time. So zuhud or abstinence is to recognize and to acknowledge that the decree of what is happening at this moment is a form of perfection. Man arafa an-nas istarah. I like this one. It says, he who knows people is at peace with himself. Which means that if you know the reality of people, you know their inner conditions and their inner state. You don't have to worry, why did this fellow not smile at me, and why did she do this, and why did he think that. And once you know that the actions of individuals is in fact the result of their inner resolve, whatever that is, and you know it's like, you're much more comfortable, if you can be comfortable with a disease, if you know its name. So naming these things, naming the true circumstances of people. He says here, the best action that one does should be done quietly and in secrecy. And to keep your distance from what is destructive. Keep your distance from self-conceit. The Nun al-Masri, who's the Masri, is from Egypt, and he's one of the early. He was actually, in the book here, he's spoken of as a Nubian, which probably means that he's from Africa. So he's probably after Bilal, Habashi, he's probably Ethiopian or Nubian. The Nun is a common name in Mosul, city currently under occupation by ISIS, because he was buried there. So a lot of people from Mosul, in Iraq, they come from Mosul, they're called the Nun. He says, yes, he was born in Nubia, which is southern Egypt.
Sudan.
He says, they asked him, what is the ma'akhsh al-hijab wa shadda? What is the thickest and the most dense of veils? And his answer was, the most effective and concealed of veils is the absorption of the self in itself and its machinations. رؤية النفس وتدبيرها. He was asked, what are the signs of those who claim they love the divine? And he says here, and this is true, I think, that if you claim to love Allah, you have to also love those who are loved by Allah, who you know Allah. So this follows the path of following the path of prophets and saints. Also, people around us who have expressed in their lives and in their inner being an unconditional love of the divine. They asked him, what is sidq, trustworthiness?
Truthfulness.
He says, truthfulness is Allah's earthly sword. Whatever it touches, it cuts. Those who claim that they know the ways of the sacred and the divine, they cannot remain in one state or one condition. But in all that is, you cannot be sort of a part-time Sufi. You cannot be a weekend this. You have to be immersed and committed, and in a path that is rigorous. So discipline, perseverance, continuity is essential. And these are courtesies that, unfortunately, are very difficult to have in this modern world, because modern world is based on sampling and grazing and butterfly going from one to the other. The discipline and perseverance needed is really essential. They asked him, what is, when you raise your hands in desire or in supplication, what is it that you're trying to do? He says these, if it's not accompanied by a rejection of your previous state, previous transgressive state, then it has really no function. There has to be a dual purpose to it. There has to be a mirror aspect to it. They ask him, what does tawakkul, which is reliance on the divine, what does that mean? He said, true reliance is to stop believing that you are the source of your own power. Now, I personally think that this is, if you take it at its face value, I don't think it's sufficient. That's why I have to read these things also critically, not in a kind of your own power. I think, if what I think he means here is that your own power seen as a kind of self-motivating, self-generating energy that doesn't recognize in its ultimate form its source being elsewhere. Now, you can and you must, I believe, this is the kind of take on what this master says, Sayyid Saqat, is that at one level, yes, you have to say, well, my power and my strength and my ability to reason and to do cognitive thinking and to weigh and so on is a power that emerges from elsewhere. Fine. That's at one level. But at a much deeper level, it is also to do with your willingness to constantly expand on the self-generative capacity while recognizing that its ultimate origin lies elsewhere. So it is not a passive relationship to the source. It must be an active relationship to the source. When I say that these works are really critical in terms of understanding the conceptual framework in which you set your own being and on your own journey, you have to be critical, but critical in a constructive way. Bringing these texts or treating them not as some kind of sacred documents, but treating them as roadmaps that have to be changed and altered as the landscape around them changes and alters. He says also, this is Sayyid Saqat, he says, let your tongue be your heart's interpreter and your visage its mirror. Let the eyes reflect the heart's condition. This, I think, is in some ways a truism. People always claim that, they always say they always say what they mean and they mean what they say. But I think with time and experience, you will gain what is known as firasa, which is kind of inner sight. And I mean, it has happened to many of us. I believe it's happened to some of us. That you are able to see the condition of people through the way that they look. Now, they say the eyes are a mirror to the soul. And this is again sort of a commonplace. But in reality, a lot of people, you can see their true substance by just one glance. And this comes from experience that develops your basira, your inner sight. So this may be a commonplace. So what you can see this on Chinese fortune cookies. But in reality, if you look at it at its significance and relate it to your own experience, you will develop this power. I vouch it. There's no question about it. It takes one glance by a person to know their reality. They asked him, what is this that we talk about all the time? The heart, you have to have a heart. Ma huwa al-qalb. And he says, al-qulub thalatha. The hearts are three. There are three hearts. First heart is like a mountain, immovable. The second is like a palm tree. Its roots are firm, but is swayed by the wind. And the third is like a feather, blowing left and right with the world. So, which heart is it? The third one can be both, the excellence and also the worst kind of heart. It can be the one that's like a feather. We say that it is not bound, it's not contained, it's not constrained, it's not fixed. Therefore, it's a free heart. It can also be one that is a heart that is completely random, chaotic, unable to. A mountain, an immovable heart, is that good? Of course it's good if it's anchored in the truth. It's terrible if it's anchored in immobility and anchored in denseness. And the in-between is always the worst, swaying left, right, and center. So, two-edged understanding of it. I asked him, what is good courtesy? He said, good courtesy is to cease harming people and to tolerate harm from them with no malice or spite. This is, the next one, this is from al-Muhasibi, the person who constantly accounted for his actions. And this got him into trouble. He said, action resulting from the heart's contemplation of the unseen is better than action from the movement of limbs. That he means in outer devotion. So reflection, dhikr, remembrance, if it's done genuinely and sincerely, is not a substitute for outer forms of prayer, but is a far significant source of inner rejuvenation than the mechanical aspects. And there's an ayah in the Quran that says, وَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ, in Surah Al-Ankabut, that is, prayer is necessary, but the remembrance of Allah is greater. So, this is really just a taste. I don't think it has been translated into English. Some of these works have been.
There's excerpts from it in a book called the Sufi Book of Shibr.
Mm-hmm.
It's excerpted
from Sunan. Yeah, it's not the Kitab al-Futuh. Is that it? Because he had a book of Futuh.
Okay, yeah. There's that. Sorry, yeah. It's that. It's Futuh.
What I would like to, if we have time, we have time?
We have 10 more minutes, 10, 15 minutes.
What I would like to talk about here is this constructively critical aspect to these early texts. Some of these early texts, frankly, appear to have some kind of sacred status, but when you read them, they are dense and unreadable, and sometimes repetitive. Sometimes they don't elevate you. So, what do you do? I mean, do you abandon? Or do you just use? Do you try to modernize them? Do you try to bring them to a condition where they are approachable, or what? I think none of the above. What we have are the concerns and the preoccupations of pre-modern people. And we have a different vocabulary, a different language that we must generate in order to re-establish the truth of this path. And without that bridge, it becomes, I think, not a false journey. It becomes a difficult journey with a false or near false consciousness. And you don't modernize it simply by changing the terms or by writing it in a more accessible way. I was thinking of that when you asked me, Sayyid Mahmoud, to bring Ibn Arabi up to date. Ibn Arabi is notoriously difficult to read in Arabic, in English, whatever. No, it's just difficult. Now, bringing it up to date, what does that mean? I thought you can, dense sentences may be reduced to more accessible wording. But frankly, it does nothing. It does nothing for me anyway. And then, after a lot of thinking about it, I would like to propose the following, that it is impossible to understand the mindset of pre-modern people unless you're a pre-modern mind yourself. And you cannot claim to be pre-modern conceptually if you're living in this world, in this day and age. So a lot of the terms that we see, unless they are put in a different framework, begin to lose their luster and either appear to be gibberish, incomprehensible, or just commonplace. But they were not commonplace when set in that pre-modern conceptual framework. And you take terms that we use, we throw about. They don't mean the same 200 years ago from what they mean today. There has been a revolution in the conceptual makeup of human beings. At least those who have been exposed to the modern world. Maybe you find somebody living in a Stone Age somewhere in Brazil, in the rain jungle, rainforest or something, maybe. But any person who has one way or the other, and all of us here have been immersed in this way of thinking, the wiring is different. So how do you relate your present capacities to texts and to claims that were made 200 and more years ago? I say 200 years, that's a cutoff point, really, when the world of the sacred lost its hold on people. And it lost its hold on people progressively. We're now probably in the last stage of it. Now, you can deny it or deny its significance, but if any of you who were in this talk that 3 years ago in the Manazil, if any of you is perplexed or agitated, you would know that it is insufficient. You need to form some kind of bridge that links your preoccupations and concerns with a vocabulary and a grammar of the spiritual world with which you can relate and to which you can relate. And so some of these terms, as I said, have their inverse opposite. And sometimes these terms are used depending where they fall, whether it's an ethical term or whether it's a term that is seen from the point of view of Tawheed. They have entirely different meanings. Entirely different. I'll just give you an example. Just take one, just one at a time. I've just come across the word dhikr, for example. Dhikr or zikr is a kind of process by which you consciously remember and reflect. Some of the Gnostics say that dhikr is to consciously forget. If you forget, then what is left is just an absolute vacuum. And that's a far better mechanism of receptivity than a soul that's in constant remembrance. So which one is it? Which one do you aspire to? Which one do you have a predisposition towards? The common form says a kind of vocal remembrance, or a common form says it's a kind of reflection and recollection and repetition. But a more, I won't say sublime, but an entirely different perspective is through dhikr is not to recall anything except the madhkur, that is the one who is remembered. So true dhikr may be silence. These are subtle changes or differences, which in my mind form the foundations for creating this bridging language. And the bridging language, I think, for modern day individuals must privilege the individual over the collective understanding. So the individual's predisposition, the individual's inclination, the individual's orientation, the collection of events and experiences that have gone into forming your individuality, as it were, are a central element in gauging the appropriateness of terms, statements, pathways, and so on. Rather than being, if you're conventional you might be, then of course you go through the conventional route. If you somehow lost your rootings in the modern world, then you can use these classical texts very, very productively. But this is really for the very, very lucky few. For those who don't have that capacity or that inclination or that predisposition, then I think you have to re-examine your foundational precepts in the way that Muhasibi does this, famous Sufi, and come up with aids, verbal aids, conceptual aids that make sense of what you're trying to do. I think I'll stop.
We have time for maybe 2 questions before we go. Please.
I have one question. You said we talked about the unity of existence, and ethics was byproduct. And as I understand, it seems to suggest that maybe there's a lot too much focus on ethics, not really understanding actually once you get unity of wujud, unity of existence. Once you understand that, ethics just comes naturally. Can you elaborate on that, please?
No, I didn't say ethics come naturally. I said that ethics, as we understand what ethics mean, not in the Wujudi sense. Take any term of ethics, for example, sincere conduct. When you say sincere conduct, you mean there's always your behavior and your action vis-a-vis another. You can't exhibit sincerity if there's no person who is receiving your sincerity. You cannot be sincere in absolute terms unless it is in the form of duality. I mean, you can't claim sincerity unless somebody is receiving that sincerity of yours. This is the conventional ethical framework, that it's framed in terms of actions, behavior, a kind of moral conduct vis-a-vis another. When you frame it in terms of tawheed, of unity, the relationship is no longer horizontal. It's a vertical relationship. So your sincerity is to the notion of unity and unicity, not in terms of your behavior. There's no behavioral aspects to it. So those who are inclined in the Gnostic Ma'rifah direction, their behavior, their inner behavior, as it were, is governed by their understanding of how this relationship is framed between you and the divine realm. So, okay, you frame it in a certain way. What does that mean in terms of your outer action? Can you be sincere at one level while being insincere at another level? The people of Tawheed will say it doesn't really matter how the outer level is framed. It has no meaning. The only level that matters is between you and the vertical axis. Those who want to put it within the framework of outer systems, because you cannot be only anchored vertically. You can if you are so-called majdoob, if you're a person who is seized and you have no interest in what others are related to it. But the people of Tawheed will say true sincerity is defined by your relationship with the One. I'll just try to get a proper definition from For example, one of the followers of Ibn Arabi is called Tahani. He defines sincerity as sincerity is to for creation, not to do anything except through the power of the Creator. Now, this has no relationship between this sincerity and my sincerity to a third party. If you frame it in this way, without an outer boundaries, you're going to hit a problem with the rest of the world, who may reject the way that you interact. So, the way that it's resolved amongst the Wahdat al-Wujud, or the Gnostics, or the Ahl al-Ma'rif, is to accept the formal definition of ethics while keeping its substance to the vertical.
One of the questions I had was regarding this idea of disenchantment in modern society, like what Max Weber describes, and how this creates a kind of a fetish for very old modes of spirituality or just old ways of living, and how sometimes this can be the draw towards spirituality for people who want to almost recreate the kind of pre-modern existence or the pre-modern mindset, and how this often, it's quite difficult for individuals to distinguish this and when this is happening, and how, in my understanding, this kind of leads to a sedative type of spirituality rather than one which actually develops the individual. And so I was trying to figure out more how one discovers the latter and sort of looking at this bridge formula. And also how this bridge could even reach further back. Because if you look at some tarifas, for example, in Sudan, they have the Samaniya who jump in their zikr. But then if you see like the Maasai tribes who have an older culture, they are jumping too. And so this seems to be an older tradition which continued through the Sufi practices. And so there's some kind of core spirituality that is enduring within the traditions, and how this idea of a bridge can go both ways to unearth more of this core spirituality, and how that can be a kind of developmental function rather than a sedative one.
No, I agree with you. As far as I understood what you were saying, I think I did. What I'm trying to say, apart from what you said, which has considerable truth in it, is that we are also preoccupied with things and with notions and concepts that are basically alien to pre-modern minds. For example, the notion of rights, the notion of freedom, the notion of equality, the notion of even justice. These are not terms that are... You try to find me any classical text that talks about freedom. Freedom is inevitably seen in terms of slave, non-slave, because there is no freedom except the one. So the notion of human freedom never existed in enchanted societies, in societies where the sense of the sacred is. Now, I personally am very much concerned with freedom. I'm very much concerned with equality. Equality, what does equality mean? You can troll through centuries of text, and the word for equality doesn't emerge once. So does that mean it is a non-existent value? If you look at pre-modern texts, yes, there's no equality. There's no equality of human beings. It doesn't exist. There's only equality in bondage to the divine. That's the only form of equality. But we understand it differently. So how do you come from a world where the terms are defined, values relate to the divine, from a world where values are disconnected from the divine? Now, what you want to do is to take these values that are real to you and me, and you can't just sort of say, well, equality means that Islam is for equality, or the great religions don't. They don't, because they don't see the world in these terms. So the bridge is both ways. It works from trying to project understandings of virtues, whatever the virtues were, from there to now. Freedom. There was no virtue in freedom before. The idea of being free implied that you were not a slave. No woman was considered to be free. The only free individual is the absolute monarch, the Oriental despot. And that's only a very poor reflection of the divine freedom. But we understand freedom in a much more palpable way. So how do we spiritualize the modern notion of freedom? I think there are ways. It's not a mechanistic way, but there are ways in which there are discursive ways in which you can examine freedom in its current meaning and give it a strong spiritual dimension, a spiritual context. I made a few words, for example. Modesty. Modesty was one of the greatest virtues before. We're living in an immodest world. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't give that virtue any significance, but I can be real and say that I cannot define modesty anymore in this particular fashion. It has to have an entirely different weight, different meaning. One of the words, for example, that had profound effect on people is taqwa, or piety. Pious is now a kind of derogatory term. Say, don't be pious. Don't be boorish, sanctimonious. But piety is seen in terms of outer behavior in pre-modern times is understood as a kind of outer form of but seen in the vertical aspect that Sayyidi was referring to. That's a bridge that you can jump to in creating an understanding of piety that is connected vertically rather than a horizontal understanding. So, again, I mentioned fairness, a fair society. Ansaf hardly ever was mentioned in the past. But all of us here want to live in a fair world. So you find a rough time trying to find any mention of fairness. So what do? Do we ignore that? Or do we try to take these terms that have our profound meaning for us and inject into them a vitality that is lacking? And so on. I mean, rights. If you talk to somebody before about rights, they laugh at you. No such thing as rights. They're only duties. So human rights, you can have all these silly tones about, how Islam is for human rights. That's not true. There is no such mention of it in that form. But the essence of rights is something that we all acknowledge and believe in. So I have to find a new vocabulary. And so on.
Okay, thank you.
Happiness.
Sa'ada, yes.
Happiness.
That's very. It's actually a borrowed term. Happiness. Borrowed term in the sense that it means different. What you mean by happiness is not what is meant by Aristotle, and certainly is not what was meant by Ibn Arabi. Many of the Gnostics of that period say that the drive of human societies is towards sa'ada, but it's a borrowed term. It doesn't. The word does not really. It's not even mentioned, is it? Sa'ada. Not even Sa'id.
Might be. It might be.
I mean, there's a lot of these Greek concepts that filtered into it and became really sort of appendages to some extent. Happiness was never seen as a virtue to pursue. But it's a very important drive now. So the drive to be happy, to be contentment is what was mentioned, always. But that's different from being happy. So do you want to be happy or do you want to be content? That is the question. If you want to be content, then there is a spiritual pathway to content. Yeah. I knew you'd find one. Sorry, they said they will be happy in heaven.
And what about joy? So is it linked to joy? Joy is
sad. It's a kind of superlative happiness.
Sorry?
Superlative happiness. But contentment is better because contentment implies continuity. Happiness is ephemeral.
Thank you. So we'll continue next week, inshallah. The second session.
Next week?
Do you want to continue next week? Okay, so we'll take 5 minutes and then start
I have to go home
session.
for very late at night. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I like Surah 2, it's very powerful. Okay, inshallah. Thank you. السلام عليكم.
Alhamdulillah, how are you?
Alhamdulillah.
No, please come, please. Don't worry, don't worry. I just wanted to be with you for 1 minute. Alhamdulillah, good to see you. Good to see you. You keeping well too? Allah Hafiz.
No.